Chosen one, pause your scrolling mind and steady your breath for a moment. Because this is not random content drifting through your feed like digital dust catching sunlight. This is a divine interruption. This is a rescue signal cutting through noise at the exact second you needed it most. You have seen thousands of videos, countless messages, endless opinions, but this one feels different. And that difference is not accidental. Something in you tightened when you read the title. Something in your chest recognized the weight of these words before your logic could process them. That is not coincidence. That is alignment. 24 hours ago, maybe even less, you whispered something into the quiet that you have not dared to say out loud in months. When the house was silent, when the lights were off, when no one was watching you, breathed a prayer that sounded like surrender. You said, "God, I need a sign. I cannot keep going like this." That whisper did not vanish into the ceiling. It did not dissolve into emptiness. It triggered a response. Heaven does not operate on human delay. When your spirit reached upward, something shifted. This message is not here because an algorithm decided to recommend it. It is here because your desperation pierced the veil of distraction and pulled the answer toward you. You think you clicked on this video, but spiritually you summoned it. This is not passive entertainment. It is an appointment written into your timeline before you understood why you needed it. And appointments require participation. That is why you feel the nudge to do something physical, something intentional. When you subscribe, when you like, when you engage, you are not just pressing buttons. You are signaling alignment. You are declaring, "I am present. I am listening. I am ready." In a world where attention is scattered like confetti in a storm, choosing to focus is an act of spiritual warfare. You are training your mind to lock onto purpose instead of panic. You are telling your own nervous system that this moment matters. And it does. Because beneath the urgency of this interruption lies a truth you have been avoiding. You are exhausted. Not physically tired in the way sleep can fix, but soul tired. The kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and makes even small decisions feel heavy. You have been the strong one for so long that weakness feels illegal. You carry responsibilities like invisible armor, and everyone sees your competence, but no one sees the cracks forming underneath. You have reached a breaking point you do not talk about because talking about it would make it real. So you asked for a sign. Not because you are dramatic, not because you want spectacle, but because you are at the edge. You needed reassurance that your endurance is not pointless, that your sacrifices are seen, that your prayers are not echoing in a hollow room. This is that reassurance. This interruption is the answer to your whispered plea. It is a reminder that you are not abandoned in your fatigue, not forgotten in your faithfulness, not invisible in your quiet obedience. You are standing at a threshold between collapse and calling, and this moment is the hinge. The sign you asked for does not arrive as thunder or lightning. It arrives as clarity. It arrives as focus. It arrives as a voice cutting through chaos saying, "I see you. I heard you. Stay with me." And if you can stay present right now, if you can let this message settle into your spirit instead of rushing past it, you will realize something profound. You are not at the end. You are at the turning point. And what you are feeling right now beneath the surface of your composed face and responsible routines is what can only be described as the invisible isolation of the chosen one. A form of exhaustion that does not live in your muscles, but in your spirit. A depletion that sleep cannot repair and vacations cannot erase. Because this is not about physical energy, but about the weight of constant expectation pressing against your inner world. It is the fatigue of always being the one who holds it together, the one who answers the late-night calls, the one who absorbs everyone else's crisis while quietly postponing your own. And there is a particular ache that forms when your identity becomes synonymous with strength. Because strength, when misunderstood, turns into a prison where you are admired for your stability, yet denied permission to unravel, and so you carry on functioning, providing, leading, solving, comforting, advising, while something deep within you whispers that you are running on fumes, that your smile has become a uniform, that your calm tone is sometimes just discipline masking overwhelm. You wake up tired, not because you did not sleep, but because even in sleep, your nervous system does not fully rest. It stays alert, scanning for the next responsibility, the next problem, to fix the next emotional wave to steady. And this is the kind of tired that settles behind your eyes and makes ordinary tasks feel monumental, that makes you sit in silence longer than usual before answering simple questions, that makes your chest feel tight, for reasons you cannot logically explain, because your soul has been sprinting a marathon without applause and without relief. You have been labeled the strong one for so long that you no longer remember when you accepted the role. And now it feels irreversible, because if you crumble, what happens to everyone who leans on you? If you admit you are overwhelmed, who steps in if you say you cannot do this anymore? Who keeps the structure standing? And so you swallow your own needs and tell yourself that endurance is holiness, that perseverance is proof of faith, that silence is maturity. Yet what no one sees is the private cost of this resilience, the moments when you stare at nothing and feel everything. The quiet negotiations you have with God, where you say, "I am trying, but I am tired." The internal debate between duty and desire, between obligation and authenticity. And perhaps the clearest picture of this isolation is that familiar scene you know too well, the driveway moment when you pull into your home and turn off the engine, but do not immediately open the door, when the house is only a few steps away, yet it feels like a stage you must prepare yourself to enter, and you sit there gripping the steering wheel, not because you are confused about where you are, but because you are bracing yourself for who you must be once you walk inside. Because inside that door, you are the parent, the partner, the provider, the stabilizer, the encourager, the decision maker. And in those few stolen minutes in the car, you allow yourself to exhale without performance, to feel the weight without managing it, to admit in the privacy of your own thoughts that you are not invincible. And sometimes tears come without warning. Not dramatic sobs, but quiet streams that surprise you, because they carry weeks, months, maybe years of unspoken pressure. And then you wipe your face, adjust your posture, and step into the house with composure, because the role must continue, and this chosen one is the invisible isolation. The loneliness that exists not because you lack people, but because you lack equal understanding. You can be surrounded by family, coworkers, friends, church members, and still feel profoundly alone, because loneliness is not the absence of bodies, but the absence of resonance. It is the feeling that no one truly speaks your internal language, that no one fully grasps the depth of what you carry, that even when you try to explain your words, feel inadequate, because how do you articulate the exhaustion of being everyone's safety net? How do you confess that sometimes you wish someone would rescue you the way you rescue others, without sounding ungrateful or weak? And so you grow quieter about your struggles. You become selective about what you share, and gradually you adapt to functioning without being fully known. This is not arrogance, it is adaptation. It is what happens when your capacity exceeds your support. And while others admire your composure, you privately question how much longer you can sustain it. You are not the first to stand under this weight. And that is why the story of Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19 matters more than many realize, because Elijah had just witnessed fire fall from heaven. He had confronted prophets. He had demonstrated undeniable power. He had experienced public victory. And yet the next scene does not show him celebrating, but running, hiding, collapsing under a broom tree, whispering a prayer that sounds eerily similar to yours. "It is enough, Lord," not because he truly wanted to die, but because he wanted the pressure to stop. He wanted the adrenaline to subside. He wanted relief from the constant confrontation and expectation. Elijah's breakdown did not follow failure. It followed triumph, and that detail is crucial because burnout often arrives after success, after seasons of intensity, where you held the line defended, truth carried responsibility, and then suddenly, your nervous system crashes under the accumulated strain. And you sit under your own metaphorical broom tree, not literally in a desert, but emotionally in a space of depletion, where you question whether you can continue, where you wonder if you misheard your calling, where you ask God for a sign because silence feels unbearable. Notice what God did not do for Elijah. He did not scold him for weakness. He did not revoke his assignment. He did not demand immediate bravery. Instead, he allowed Elijah to rest, to sleep, to eat, to recover, because even prophets require replenishment. Even the anointed require care. And if Elijah, a man who called down fire, could collapse under a tree and confess exhaustion, then your fatigue is not proof of failure, but evidence of humanity meeting divine responsibility. It is the intersection where your capacity met its limit, and your spirit cried out for reinforcement. And perhaps what you call weakness is actually the body's alarm system, signaling that you have been in survival mode too long, that constant vigilance has taxed your nervous system, that being the strong one without safe release has accumulated internal strain. There is a profound difference between being strong and being supported, and many chosen ones master the first while neglecting the second, believing that reliance equals regression, that needing encouragement contradicts calling. Yet even the most resilient structures require maintenance, and what you are experiencing is not the end of your strength, but the unveiling of its cost. Your driveway moments are not signs that you are unfit for your role. They are sacred pauses where your authenticity surfaces before performance resumes. And instead of condemning those pauses, you must honor them as signals that your soul is asking to be seen by you, not just by God, but by your own awareness. The invisible isolation begins to lose its grip when you recognize that your exhaustion does not disqualify you. It humanizes you that your tears in the parked car are not evidence of collapse but of depth, that your longing to be understood is not selfish but sacred, because strength without vulnerability becomes brittle, and God does not call you to brittle endurance, but to sustained alignment. Elijah's story continues beyond the broom tree, and so does yours, because the same God who met him in whispering gentleness is meeting you in this moment, not with accusation, but with acknowledgement, not with thunder, but with presence, reminding you that your weariness is seen, that your hidden battles are counted, that your silent sacrifices are recorded, and that isolation, while real, is not permanent, because the very awareness of it is the first step toward restoration. And restoration begins not when you push harder, but when you admit that you are tired and still chosen, weary and still worthy, exhausted and still essential to the unfolding story. And as you sit with the weight of your exhaustion and the memory of your own broom tree moment, another question inevitably rises in your mind, one that has echoed through your prayers more than once. If God sees me, if God knows, if God cares, then why does it feel like He is silent? Why does it feel like my words disappear into the air without response? Why does it seem that heaven is quiet precisely when I need it to speak the loudest? This is where the deeper misunderstanding begins. Because you have equated unanswered prayers with divine absence, you have mistaken delay for disinterest. And in the stillness between your request and visible change, you have concluded that perhaps the line has gone dead. What if the issue has never been silence on God's end, but reception on yours? What if the transmission has been constant, but your internal receiver has been overwhelmed, distorted, jammed by frequencies that compete for your attention every waking second? Imagine for a moment an old radio sitting on a kitchen counter, broadcasting signals all around it. Invisible waves carrying music, voices, messages across space. And yet what determines what you hear is not what is being transmitted, but what the dial is tuned to. If the station you long for is broadcasting on FM 99.9, but your dial is fixed on AM 600, you can sit there all day insisting there is no music in the air, no melody available, no message being sent. When in reality, the sound is present, vibrant, waiting, but your instrument is misaligned. This is the frequency problem, not a theological failure, but a tuning dilemma, not a lack of divine speech, but a saturation of human noise. And when you have lived for months or years in survival mode, constantly calculating bills, deadlines, expectations, conversations, potential conflicts, your internal dial gradually locks into a frequency of urgency, and urgency is loud. It crackles like static. It demands immediate reaction. It pulls your nervous system into a heightened state where everything feels like it must be solved now or else. And in that heightened state, your brain shifts into what science calls beta waves, fast, reactive, analytical patterns designed to keep you safe, but not designed to cultivate deep spiritual perception. Beta is useful for driving in traffic, negotiating contracts, managing crises, but it is not the most receptive state for communion, for subtle instruction, for the whisper that requires spaciousness to be heard. And when your entire day is structured around urgency, you carry that internal speed into prayer, into worship, into moments that are meant to be restorative. And you sit down to pray, but your thoughts are sprinting. You close your eyes, but your mind is drafting emails, replaying conversations, calculating consequences. And when no immediate dramatic voice interrupts the chaos, you assume God is not responding, when in truth you are attempting to hear a whisper beside a jet engine. Survival mode, with its stress hormones and constant vigilance, is like leaving the radio between stations, where static overwhelms clarity, and the longer you live there, the more normal the static feels, until silence itself becomes uncomfortable. This is why the verse in Psalm 46:10 is far more radical than we often allow it to be, because when it says, "Be still and know that I am God," the Hebrew word used there is Rapha, and Rapha does not mean merely sit quietly with your hands folded in passive resignation. It means slacken, release, let drop, loosen your grip. It implies the deliberate unclenching of what you have been holding so tightly. It is the opposite of the driveway moment where your knuckles whiten around the steering wheel. It is the invitation to physically and mentally downshift, to move from clenched to open, from braced to surrendered, from controlling to receptive. Rapha is not inactivity, it is intentional release. It is saying, I will stop forcing outcomes long enough to perceive instruction. I will allow my nervous system to settle so that my spirit can surface. I will create internal space where revelation can land. Consider how often you have approached God in beta mode, listing requests, presenting arguments, asking for immediate signs. And when the heavens do not thunder in response, you leave feeling unheard. Yet what if knowing God requires a different internal posture than demanding answers? What if divine communication operates at a frequency that cannot be accessed through agitation, but through alignment? And this is not mysticism detached from reality, but biology cooperating with spirituality. Because when you downshift your brain from beta into slower rhythms like alpha and theta, your body reduces stress, hormones, your heart rate, steadies your prefrontal cortex, engages differently, creativity increases, intuition becomes clearer, and you become more capable of perceiving subtle impressions rather than only dramatic events. Jesus himself modeled this pattern repeatedly. withdrawing from crowds, stepping away from demands, retreating to mountains or boats. Not because he lacked power, but because he understood the necessity of recalibration. He knew that constant exposure to human need without intentional retreat would drain the channel through which he operated. You have been asking God to shout over the noise while refusing to lower the volume of your environment. And this is not condemnation, but clarity. Because once you understand the mechanism, you regain agency. You realize that perhaps heaven has been broadcasting consistently, but your internal frequency has been saturated with notifications, news cycles, internal dialogues of fear and planning, and when stress becomes chronic, your body remains in fight or flight even when you are physically safe, which means your mind is scanning for threats instead of listening for guidance. Survival mode is excellent for crisis, but terrible for communion. And the modern world is engineered to keep you in crisis perception, from headlines that trigger outrage to endless digital alerts that fracture attention. You are neurologically nudged toward beta dominance. And then you wonder why prayer feels dry, why worship feels distant, why clarity feels elusive. The shift you need is not louder effort, but deeper release, not more words, but more stillness, not more striving, but more Rafa. Because forcing spiritual breakthrough through intensity often amplifies the very static you are trying to escape. Trying harder in beta only tightens the grip, whereas surrender loosens it. And surrender here does not mean passivity or apathy, but strategic trust. It means recognizing that control has limits, and that receptivity requires spaciousness. And when you intentionally create moments to breathe slowly, to detach from devices, to let your shoulders drop, to unclench your jaw, you are not wasting time, you are tuning the dial, you are shifting from AM survival to FM communion, from reactive processing to receptive awareness. This is why the misconception that unanswered prayers equal divine silence must be dismantled. Because if you continue to believe that heaven has stopped speaking, discouragement will deepen, faith will erode, and isolation will intensify. But if you consider that perhaps the invitation has been to recalibrate rather than to quit, hope re-enters the room. You begin to see that your exhaustion may have been a signal not that God left, but that your frequency needed adjustment, that your nervous system needed relief, that your grip needed loosening. Rafa becomes not a poetic suggestion, but a survival strategy for the soul. A deliberate downshift where you step out of the swirl long enough to remember that you are not the sole architect of outcomes, that you do not have to micromanage destiny, that you can release the steering wheel without the world collapsing. And when you practice this downshift consistently, when you build rhythms of release into your life, rather than waiting for burnout to force them, something remarkable happens. Clarity begins to surface in subtle ways. Ideas arrive without strain. Peace settles without explanation. And you realize that God was not silent, but steady, not absent, but patient, waiting for the static to clear so that his voice could be discerned not as thunder, but as direction, not as spectacle, but as assurance. The frequency problem is not an indictment of your faith, but an invitation to recalibration. And once you accept that invitation, the silence you feared transforms into space. And in that space, you begin to know, not just intellectually, but experientially, that He is God, that you are not alone, and that the breakthrough you seek may begin not with more noise, but with intentional stillness. And once you begin to understand that the issue has not been divine silence, but internal static, you are ready to look deeper at the mechanics of what has been happening inside your own mind. Because the science of spiritual access is not separate from your faith, but intricately woven into how you were designed. And this is where the distinction between beta and theta becomes more than technical language and turns into revelation about why you have felt blocked despite your sincerity. Beta brainwaves are the dominant pattern of a waking, problem-solving, alert mind. They operate at a fast frequency, sharp and efficient, ideal for analysis, decision-making, navigation, calculation, and survival. And when you are paying bills, answering emails, driving through traffic, managing conversations, resolving conflict, your brain naturally fires in beta. Because beta keeps you vigilant. It scans for danger. It anticipates outcomes. It protects you from mistakes. It is the frequency of productivity and protection, but it is also the frequency of stress when prolonged. Because beta sustains a heightened state of readiness, and readiness requires energy hormones like cortisol and adrenaline circulate. Your heart rate subtly elevates your muscles, maintains slight tension. Your attention narrows, and over time this constant activation begins to feel normal, even necessary, until you cannot remember what it feels like to be deeply relaxed without guilt. The problem is not that beta exists because you need it. The problem is living there permanently because a mind locked in beta is optimized for reaction, not for revelation. And when you bring that same reactive state into your prayer life, into your spiritual seeking, you are essentially trying to perceive subtle guidance with a nervous system primed for threat detection, and threat detection does not listen for whispers, it listens for alarms. So unless something dramatic shakes your world, you assume nothing is happening. And yet there is another state available to you, one that children access naturally, and adults often forget, a slower, more fluid rhythm known as theta. Theta brainwaves emerge when you are deeply relaxed, but still aware in that space between waking and sleep. When your body feels heavy, yet your mind feels open, when imagination becomes vivid, when creativity flows without strain, when insights appear fully formed rather than logically assembled. And in neuroscience, theta is associated with memory, integration, intuition, emotional processing, and creativity. But in spiritual language, theta resembles the inner stillness where revelation feels effortless, where ideas arrive like downloads rather than drafts, where peace is not manufactured but encountered. And this is why so many profound experiences happen in liminal spaces, during quiet reflection, during worship, during solitary walks, during moments of deep breathing, because your brain shifts out of survival speed and into receptive spaciousness. Consider how often your greatest ideas have appeared not while forcing concentration, but while showering, driving calmly, or lying in bed before sleep. That is theta at work. Your analytical filter softens, and your subconscious connects patterns that beta could not assemble under pressure. And this is not mystical fantasy, but observable biology cooperating with your spirit. When you dwell in theta, your brain becomes more coherent. Hemispheres synchronize more fluidly. Creativity expands, and fear loosens its grip. And it is in this softened, aligned state that many describe hearing God most clearly, not necessarily audibly, but as deep conviction, clarity, or direction that feels anchored rather than anxious. Look at the life of Jesus through this lens and notice a pattern that is both spiritual and neurological. Before major decisions, before miracles, before choosing disciples, before facing crucifixion, he withdrew, he stepped away from crowds, from demands, from constant questions. He went to mountains, to gardens, to solitary places, not because he lacked compassion for the people, but because he understood the cost of constant exposure. He knew that remaining immersed in the noise of expectation would dilute the clarity required for alignment, so he intentionally shifted environments to shift frequency. He disengaged from external stimulation to engage with the Father at a deeper level. And this was not escapism, but calibration, not avoidance, but preparation. You, however, have often assumed that breakthrough requires more intensity, more volume, more effort. And so when you feel blocked, you try harder, you pray louder, you read more chapters, you push your focus, you strain to concentrate, believing that effort equals faith. But effort in beta mode often amplifies stress, and stress reinforces the very state that blocks subtle perception. You cannot force your way into theta the way you force your way through a deadline, because theta is entered through release, not through strain, through surrender, not through tightening. And this is where many chosen ones exhaust themselves spiritually, mistaking agitation for zeal, mistaking tension for commitment, when in truth, the doorway to deeper access is often unlocked by letting go. The mistake of trying harder instead of releasing control is deeply embedded in a culture that celebrates hustle, productivity, and constant engagement. And biologically, your environment reinforces this pattern because you are surrounded by devices engineered to capture your attention. Notifications that fragment your focus, news cycles that trigger emotional spikes, social media feeds that stimulate comparison and urgency, and every alert nudges your brain back into beta, reinforcing vigilance and reactivity, and over time your baseline shifts upward. What once felt like stress now feels normal. What once felt like overload now feels standard. And the idea of sitting in silence for 10 minutes can feel almost uncomfortable, even threatening, because your nervous system has adapted to constant stimulation. Living in this state creates a biological disadvantage for spiritual depth, because chronic beta dominance reduces your capacity for sustained introspection. It fragments memory, consolidation. It increases anxiety, and it makes stillness feel foreign. And when stillness feels foreign, you avoid it. And when you avoid it, you remain locked in surface-level engagement, wondering why deeper clarity eludes you. This is not a moral failure, but a nervous system pattern, and patterns can be retrained, but only if you recognize them. The invitation here is not to reject beta entirely, but to become conscious of when you are in it, and when you need to shift to see your nervous system as an instrument that can be tuned, rather than a tyrant that must dictate your experience. And tuning requires practice breathing, slowly reducing sensory input, stepping outside without your phone, allowing moments of unstructured quiet, not as punishment, but as preparation. And as you practice downshifting, your brain gradually relearns that safety does not require constant scanning, that productivity does not require perpetual urgency, and that clarity does not require force. When you release control long enough to enter that slower rhythm, you may discover that the answers you were striving to extract begin to surface organically, that the direction you begged for begins to crystallize without panic, that peace appears not as a dramatic intervention, but as a steady undercurrent. And this is the paradox. The less you force, the more you perceive, the less you grip, the more you receive. Because spiritual access is not conquered through intensity, but cultivated through alignment. You were not designed to live exclusively in survival mode. You were designed with the capacity to shift, to move between action and stillness, between engagement and retreat, between beta and theta. And when you honor that design, you cooperate with both your biology and your calling. So instead of asking why God is not speaking louder, ask whether you are allowing yourself to soften enough to hear instead of escalating effort. Experiment with intentional release instead of condemning yourself for distraction. Create conditions for focus because the science does not contradict your faith. It illuminates it, showing you that the same creator who formed your spirit also wired your brain. And when you steward that wiring wisely, you remove unnecessary interference and make room for communion that feels less strained and more natural, less forced and more fluid. And in that fluidity, you begin to realize that access has been available all along, waiting not for more striving, but for recalibration. And now that you understand the distinction between living in beta and accessing theta, between surviving and receiving the next question, becomes practical rather than theoretical, because awareness alone does not always create change. And knowing that you need to shift frequencies is different from actually doing it consistently in a world engineered to keep you overstimulated. This is where the concept of the genius wave enters, not as a mystical shortcut, but as a tool designed to assist what your nervous system was originally capable of doing. Naturally, a sound-based brainwave entrainment technology that functions like a tuning fork for the mind, gently guiding your brain from the fast reactive beta state into the slower, more receptive theta rhythm. And before you dismiss it as gimmick or hype, understand the mechanism, because brainwave entrainment is not speculation, but measurable science based on the principle that the brain has a tendency to synchronize its electrical activity with external rhythmic stimuli, meaning that when you are exposed to specific sound frequencies, your brain gradually mirrors those frequencies, shifting its dominant pattern without force, without strain, simply through resonance. Think of it this way: your mind is not broken, it is detuned, and stress over time acts like humidity and temperature fluctuations on a grand piano, subtly loosening the strings, altering pitch, creating dissonance where harmony once existed. And the pianist may be talented, disciplined, committed. But if the instrument is out of tune, even the most beautiful composition will sound distorted. This is what prolonged stress does to your internal instrument. It does not remove your gifts. It does not erase your calling. It does not cancel your creativity, but it introduces tension into the strings of your nervous system, and that tension shifts your default frequency upward into chronic beta making. Clarity feel distant, and inspiration feel forced. And you, assuming the problem is your discipline, try to play harder. Pray louder, concentrate longer, when what is needed is not more effort, but recalibration. The Genius Wave is presented as that recalibration tool, a digital tuning fork that emits carefully designed sound patterns intended to encourage your brain to slow its rhythm and settle into theta. Not through hypnosis or manipulation, but through entrainment. The natural tendency of oscillating systems to synchronize just as two pendulums placed near each other gradually match swings. Your neural oscillations can be influenced by consistent rhythmic input. And when that input is aligned with theta frequencies, your brain is invited to follow, to soften, to downshift, to release the grip of urgency and enter the spaciousness where creativity and insight flourish. This concept is reinforced by research that has examined how children naturally operate in higher percentages of theta and alpha states compared to adults, with some studies often referenced indicating that a significant majority of young children demonstrate high levels of creative genius markers, while that number drops dramatically by adulthood, not because potential disappears, but because conditioning increases, responsibilities multiply, stress accumulates, and the brain's baseline shifts toward analytical survival patterns. Whether you cite NASA-affiliated creativity research or broader neuroscience findings, the pattern remains compelling. Children access imaginative integrative states with ease. Adults often lose that fluidity under layers of expectation and urgency, and what you interpret as spiritual distance may partially be neurological rigidity. You did not lose your connection to divine creativity. It became buried under deadlines, disappointments, distractions, and repeated cycles of stress that trained your nervous system to prioritize threat detection over imaginative receptivity. And when you encounter a tool like the Genius Wave, the promise is not that it will magically inject revelation into your life, but that it can help reverse some of that conditioning by gently reintroducing your brain to the slower rhythms it once navigated effortlessly. It is not about outsourcing spirituality to technology. It is about leveraging technology to reduce interference so that spirituality can flow more freely. That distinction matters because this tool is not framed as a replacement for prayer. not a substitute for relationship with God. Not a mechanical hack that overrides surrender, but as soil preparation. And soil preparation is biblical wisdom. You do not scatter seeds onto hardened ground and expect abundant harvest. You soften, you remove stones, you create conditions where growth can occur. And if your mind has become like concrete from prolonged beta dominance, from constant stimulation, from years of white-knuckled responsibility, then expecting profound revelation, without first loosening that ground, may be unrealistic. Listening to a frequency designed to calm and synchronize your brain becomes analogous to breaking up the soil, creating receptivity, allowing the seeds of your prayers to take root rather than bounce off surface tension. You would not accuse a farmer of lacking faith for using tools to cultivate land before planting. So do not accuse yourself of spiritual compromise for exploring tools that support your biology in service of your spirit. The Creator who formed your nervous system is not threatened by you stewarding it wisely, and if certain sounds can reduce stress, increase coherence, and facilitate entry into theta, then using them intentionally becomes an act of alignment, not idolatry. Yet wisdom also demands discernment, which is why the encouragement is not blind acceptance but prayerful investigation, because your journey is not identical to anyone else's, and what resonates with one person may not resonate with another. Approach it not with desperation, but with curiosity, not with superstition, but with evaluation. Observe how your body responds. Notice whether your thoughts soften, whether your breathing slows, whether ideas arise more fluidly. And compare that experience to your baseline, because discernment is strengthened by awareness, and awareness grows through experimentation anchored in faith. The power of a tuning fork is not that it creates new music, but that it restores correct pitch, and once the instrument is tuned, the musician can play with freedom again. And perhaps this is what you have been missing. Not new instruction, but renewed clarity. Not louder commands, but clearer perception. And if 7 minutes of intentional listening can reduce internal static, can lower stress, hormones can invite your brain into a more receptive state, then those 7 minutes are not trivial. They are strategic. Consider how often you spend far more time scrolling through feeds that elevate beta dominance consuming content that heightens comparison and urgency, yet hesitate to invest a fraction of that time in something designed to calm and recalibrate. The genius wave, as described, becomes less about novelty and more about stewardship, about recognizing that your calling deserves a nervous system capable of sustaining it, that your vision requires a mind not perpetually fragmented by distraction, that your prayers deserve soil prepared for germination. And if technology can be misused to scatter your attention, it can also be used wisely to consolidate it. And the difference lies in intention. When you engage with such a tool, do so consciously. Frame it within your relationship with God. Invite Him into the process, ask for clarity, remain grounded, and observe outcomes not only emotionally, but practically. Because true alignment produces fruit, increased peace, improved focus, greater creativity, not merely heightened sensation. Ultimately, the genius wave is presented not as the source of revelation, but as a facilitator of readiness, not as the voice of God, but as a means of clearing static so that His voice can be perceived more clearly. And when you hold that distinction firmly, you avoid both blind skepticism and blind enthusiasm, choosing instead thoughtful exploration, because your goal is not to chase experiences, but to cultivate consistency, not to accumulate tools, but to remove interference. And if this particular instrument resonates with your system, it may serve as a practical bridge between understanding frequency in theory and experiencing it in daily life. But regardless of the tool, the principle remains the same. Your mind is an instrument. Stress can detune it. Recalibration is possible. And when you steward that process intentionally, you position yourself not for spectacle but for sustained clarity. And that clarity, more than any dramatic sign, is often the quiet evidence that you are tuning back into the frequency where purpose and peace converge. And as you begin to recalibrate, as you soften your grip, as you experiment with stillness, and perhaps even introduce tools that help you downshift into deeper clarity, something else will inevitably surface, something that can catch you off guard if you are not prepared for it. Because rising frequency does not occur in a vacuum, and spiritual growth rarely happens without resistance. The moment you move from survival mode into awareness, from static into signal, from numb endurance into intentional alignment, you become noticeable in ways you were not before. And this is not superstition, but pattern. Because throughout Scripture and throughout lived experience, elevation invites opposition, clarity attracts confrontation, and breakthrough often triggers backlash. You may notice that just when you decide to commit to a new level of discipline, distractions multiply, conversations become tense, doubts grow louder. Minor inconveniences escalate into unexpected stressors. And if you interpret these moments as signs that you are on the wrong path, you may retreat prematurely. Yet what if resistance is not proof of error, but confirmation of impact? What if the friction you feel is evidence that something is shifting in realms beyond your immediate perception? Growth changes. Energy alignment alters trajectory. And whenever trajectory changes, anything invested in your stagnation will react. This is why spiritual maturity requires both tenderness and toughness. Because when you begin to access deeper peace, when your mind becomes clearer, when your reactions become more measured, you are no longer as easily manipulated by fear, and that shift threatens systems that benefited from your confusion. Whether those systems are internal patterns, unhealthy dynamics, or spiritual opposition. Resistance intensifies when momentum shifts, and instead of interpreting that intensity as failure, you must learn to see it as pressure testing. The way wind increases against a plane during takeoff, not to destroy it, but because altitude is increasing. Fear in this context becomes particularly deceptive, because as your clarity grows, a sudden wave of apprehension may rise, whispering that you are not qualified, that you are delusional, that you are stepping beyond your place. And this fear can feel so convincing that you assume it is wisdom, warning you to stay small. Yet examine the pattern in Scripture. Consider Moses in Exodus chapter 3, standing before a bush that burned without being consumed, encountering a holy moment so overwhelming that his first response was not eagerness, but hesitation, not confidence, but protest. He hid his face. He questioned his worthiness. He listed his inadequacies. "Who am I that I should go?" he asked. And this question was not arrogance, but trembling awareness of the weight of calling. Moses did not doubt because he lacked potential. He doubted because he sensed magnitude. And magnitude awakens fear in anyone who understands responsibility. If he had responded with boastful enthusiasm, we might question his depth, but his trembling revealed reverence. And this distinction is crucial because the chosen one trembles at the assignment, while the imposter rushes toward spotlight without considering cost. The chosen one feels the gravity of influence. The imposter feels the thrill of attention. And when fear surfaces as you step toward greater alignment, it may not be a signal to retreat, but a sign that you are encountering something that matters. The trembling chosen one is not paralyzed by fear, but refined by it, because fear exposes areas where humility must deepen, where reliance on God must strengthen, where ego must decrease. And rather than interpreting fear as evidence that you are unworthy, recognize it as evidence that you are aware, that you understand, that influence is not casual, that visibility carries weight. that when you rise, eyes will follow, and eyes bring expectation. Responsibility is the hidden companion of elevation, and many desire platform without pressure, impact without accountability, authority without surrender. Yet spiritual authority is not cosmetic. It carries consequences. It demands integrity. It requires alignment between private discipline and public expression. As your frequency rises, as your clarity sharpens, as your peace stabilizes, you may find that certain relationships shift, that some people feel uncomfortable around your calm, that dynamics built on your former reactivity lose traction. And this too is resistance, not necessarily malicious, but uncomfortable because growth disrupts equilibrium. And whenever equilibrium changes, friction appears. Do not confuse friction with failure, because without friction, movement cannot be tested. And if your peace were fragile, it would shatter at the first hint of tension. But if it is anchored, it will withstand the pushback. There is also a psychological dimension to this resistance, because when you begin to believe that your life carries greater purpose, that your voice matters, that your insight has value, internal narratives shaped by past criticism or insecurity may resurface, attempting to shrink you back into familiar limitation. And this internal resistance can feel like humility, but often disguises fear of responsibility. Because stepping into calling requires relinquishing excuses. Once you accept that you are capable, you can no longer justify stagnation with self-doubt, and accountability intensifies. Visibility brings responsibility in subtle ways, because when your clarity increases, your choices influence others more directly. Your words carry more weight. Your presence alters atmosphere, and with that influence comes expectation to steward it wisely. The higher you rise in alignment, the more crucial your consistency becomes, because inconsistency at higher levels creates greater ripple effects. And this awareness can feel heavy, can make you question whether anonymity was easier, whether confusion was simpler. Yet ease is not the measure of calling, and comfort is not the metric of growth. The arrogant imposter seeks elevation for validation, while the trembling chosen one accepts elevation for service, and service always carries cost, whether in time, energy, scrutiny, or sacrifice. When Moses protested his inadequacy, God did not dismiss his fear, but redirected it not. You are enough on your own, but I will be with you. Shifting focus from personal capacity to divine partnership. And this is the anchor that stabilizes rising frequency. Because if you interpret growth as self-generated, pressure will crush you. But if you interpret growth as collaboration with God, pressure becomes refining rather than destroying. Expect resistance not as a curse, but as confirmation that something meaningful is unfolding. And instead of reacting to fear with retreat, respond with inquiry. Ask what this fear reveals about the weight of what you are stepping into, and let it drive you deeper into humility rather than back into hiding. Remember that genuine authority feels heavy at first, like a crown that requires adjustment. And if it did not, it would likely be ornamental rather than authentic. As your frequency rises, opposition may attempt to amplify noise to provoke reaction, to lure you back into beta agitation, where clarity is compromised, because reactive minds are easier to manipulate than regulated ones. But when you recognize this pattern, you can choose response over reaction, stillness over escalation, alignment over impulse, and in doing so, you demonstrate that resistance does not dictate direction. Your growth is not validated by the absence of opposition, but by your steadiness within it. And the very presence of resistance becomes evidence that you are no longer invisible in the spiritual landscape. So do not be surprised when clarity invites challenge, when peace provokes pushback, when commitment triggers confrontation, because elevation alters atmosphere, and atmosphere rarely shifts without turbulence. Yet turbulence at higher altitude is not a signal to descend, but to stabilize, to trust the structure supporting you. To remember that trembling does not disqualify you, it humanizes you, and the weight you feel is not punishment, but proof that you are carrying something significant. Embrace the responsibility, steward. The visibility, remain humble in assent, and let resistance refine rather than redefine you. Because rising frequency may trigger opposition, but it also signals that you are moving beyond survival into influence, and influence, when surrendered to God, becomes not burden but blessing. And as you begin to accept that rising frequency invites resistance, you must also learn to recognize the specific forms that resistance takes, because opposition rarely announces itself dramatically at first. It often arrives subtly, disguised as inconvenience, disguised as your own thoughts, disguised as ordinary fatigue. And if you are unaware of these patterns, you may misinterpret them as coincidence or personal weakness, rather than what they truly are. Strategic interferences designed to disrupt your momentum just as clarity begins to form. The first of these interferences reveals itself through distraction. And distraction is rarely random when you are on the verge of breakthrough. Notice how often the moment you decide to sit in stillness, to pray intentionally, to listen, to recalibrate something external, demands your attention, your phone vibrates without urgency, a notification appears that suddenly feels critical. Someone calls with a minor issue that feels immediate. An appliance malfunctions. A thought about an unfinished task becomes overwhelmingly loud. And what could have waited now insists on being addressed immediately. And if you are not discerning, you will abandon your moment of alignment to chase the interruption. Telling yourself you will return later, yet later often never arrives. Distraction is effective, not because it is powerful, but because it is persistent. It fragments your focus just enough to prevent depth, and depth is what shifts frequency. Shallow engagement keeps you in surface-level beta, where nothing transformative occurs. And so distraction does not need to destroy your faith. It only needs to dilute your attention, because diluted attention cannot sustain breakthrough. And the enemy understands that even 7 uninterrupted minutes of focused alignment can recalibrate your system, so the goal becomes breaking momentum before it stabilizes. When you recognize this pattern, do not respond with frustration, but with strategy, because awareness neutralizes manipulation. And instead of chasing every alert, practice guarding sacred moments. Silence your devices. Set boundaries. Treat your time of alignment as an appointment rather than an optional pause, because momentum is fragile in its early stages, and what is fragile must be protected. The second interference often emerges internally rather than externally, and it manifests as doubt, not the healthy questioning that leads to wisdom, but the subtle accusatory whisper that mirrors your own voice yet carries a different tone. A tone that undermines rather than clarifies. And this is the ancient pattern traced back to the garden in Genesis, where the serpent did not begin with denial but with distortion. Did God really say, he asked, planting uncertainty not about God's existence but about God's intention. And that same pattern reappears when you begin to grow, when you start to access clarity, when peace begins to settle, and suddenly a thought intrudes, suggesting that you are imagining things, that you are being dramatic, that this pursuit is foolish, that you are overestimating your calling. And because the voice sounds familiar, you assume it is your own reasoning, when in reality, it carries the same undermining cadence that has disrupted faith for generations. Doubt in this form is not inquiry, but erosion. It does not seek truth, but seeks paralysis, and its goal is to pull you back into confusion, where action stalls and momentum dissolves. Arguing with this kind of doubt often strengthens it, because debate keeps you engaged on its terms, and instead, the wiser response is recognition and dismissal, acknowledging the thought without partnering with it, reaffirming truth rather than negotiating with distortion, because you cannot reason with deception. You can only refuse it authority, And when you do, its volume decreases. The third interference is perhaps the most deceptive because it disguises itself as something entirely physical and therefore harmless. And that interference is sudden fatigue, the inexplicable wave of sleepiness that hits precisely when you attempt to engage spiritually, the heaviness in your eyelids that was absent moments before while scrolling through trivial content, the yawns that appear not during distraction, but during devotion. And while physical tiredness is real and must be respected, there is a pattern worth observing when lethargy consistently coincides with spiritual focus. This is what can be described as spiritual sedation, not always dramatic but subtly effective, because if you can be lulled back into passivity, you will never fully awaken to the clarity available to you. Fatigue in this context is not about your body's genuine need for rest, but about your system resisting unfamiliar stillness, because when you shift out of chronic stimulation, your nervous system initially interprets the absence of input as a cue to power down. And if you are not intentional, you will drift into sleep instead of into awareness, and the enemy benefits from sedation. Because a sleeping mind does not discern patterns, does not challenge narratives, does not access authority. The remedy is not self-condemnation, but activation. If heaviness strikes during alignment, change posture, sit upright. Stand, breathe deeply, adjust your environment signal to your body that this is not a time for collapse, but for clarity, because your physical stance influences your mental state, and small adjustments can prevent premature shutdown. These three interferences, distraction, doubt, and fatigue, form a cycle designed to keep you oscillating at the surface, never descending into the depth where transformation occurs. And recognizing them does not make you paranoid, but prepared, because preparedness reduces panic. And when you expect interruption, you are less destabilized by it. Instead of asking why everything seems to go wrong when you commit to growth, understand that growth disrupts inertia, and inertia resists disruption. You are not being attacked because you are weak. You are being challenged because you are shifting, and shifting alters patterns that once benefited from your stagnation. Do not interpret resistance as a verdict against you, but as evidence that your movement matters. And rather than retreating when distraction appears, when doubt whispers, when fatigue presses, anchor yourself more firmly. Shorten your focus if needed, but do not abandon it. Even a few minutes of sustained alignment can break cycles that months of surface engagement cannot. And as you persist through these interferences, you strengthen not only your spiritual clarity, but your mental discipline, proving to yourself that your growth is not fragile, but resilient, not accidental, but intentional. And in that resilience, interference loses its power, and momentum becomes yours to steward. And once you learn to recognize distraction, doubt, and fatigue as interferences rather than personal failures, you are ready to understand a deeper spiritual pattern that explains why resistance often intensifies right after commitment. Because there is a biblical rhythm to breakthrough that many overlook, a rhythm I call the Daniel pattern. And you see it clearly when you examine both ancient scripture and modern testimony side by side. Consider the story of Sarah, not as a celebrity figure, but as an ordinary woman carrying extraordinary exhaustion, someone who had been praying for years without visible movement, someone who felt as though her words dissolved into air, someone who finally decided to stop dabbling in spiritual discipline and instead commit intentionally to recalibration, to stillness, to frequency alignment. And what happened next did not look like immediate blessing, but amplified disruption. Within days of her decision, inconveniences multiplied. Small tensions escalated into arguments, unexpected expenses surfaced, technical failures occurred at the worst moments. And internally, she felt waves of doubt, questioning whether she had made a mistake by leaning in deeper rather than pulling back. What she did not realize at first was that resistance often escalates precisely because momentum has begun, and momentum threatens stagnation. So systems accustomed to your inertia react when you shift direction. Instead of interpreting this escalation as a warning to stop, Sarah chose to implement what can be described as a 3-day silence protocol. Not silence as isolation from life, but silence as intentional containment. Meaning she did not announce her commitment publicly, she did not seek validation through posts or conversations, she did not broadcast her spiritual discipline to invite opinions. She simply entered a focused window of private recalibration, listening, praying, aligning, and refusing to narrate the process to others. This containment preserved momentum because public declaration without internal stabilization can leak energy. And when you are in the early stages of breakthrough, your focus must be guarded rather than displayed. The Daniel pattern in chapter 10 mirrors this principle with striking clarity. Because Daniel set his mind to seek understanding, he committed internally before external results manifested. And when the angel finally appeared, the message was not that heaven had been silent, but that from the first day his words were heard. Yet spiritual resistance delayed visible manifestation for 21 days. This detail reframes delay entirely because delay was not denial, and opposition was not absence. It was proof that something of value was in transit. When you experience resistance after commitment, instead of assuming you are off course, consider the possibility that you have activated movement in realms you cannot immediately see, and that movement requires perseverance to complete. Sarah, during her 3-day protocol, resisted the urge to interpret external chaos as divine disapproval. She recognized it as interference, and by maintaining private discipline without seeking immediate affirmation, she stabilized her frequency long enough for clarity to emerge. And within weeks, she experienced not dramatic spectacle but undeniable direction. A download of strategy that had eluded her for years of anxious striving. This is the essence of the Daniel pattern. Commitment initiates response, response triggers resistance, resistance tests endurance. Endurance refines. Focus, and focus sustains breakthrough. If resistance were absent, the value of what you are pursuing might be minimal because opposition tends to correspond with significance. And when you feel friction after stepping forward, do not rush to retreat. Instead, shorten your focus window if necessary. Commit to a contained period of silence, 3 days, 7 days. A defined span where you guard your attention and resist the urge to narrate your process prematurely. Resistance is not a verdict against your calling, but evidence that your calling carries weight, and weight attracts contest. When you persist through that contest quietly, steadily, without theatrics, you mirror Daniel's endurance and Sarah's resolve, and in doing so, you transform delay into development, because the breakthrough that withstands resistance becomes anchored rather than fleeting. And once anchored, it cannot be easily shaken. And now you arrive at the point where understanding must become embodiment, where insight must translate into alignment, because awareness without activation leaves transformation incomplete. So this is the moment to shift your posture, not merely metaphorically, but physically, to sit upright or stand. If you are able to let your shoulders settle back, to lift your chin slightly, because posture communicates permission to your nervous system. And when you change your posture intentionally, you signal readiness. You declare through your body what your spirit has been preparing to receive. This is not ritual for performance, but alignment for activation. A subtle but powerful declaration that you are no longer collapsing under pressure, but standing within purpose. Imagine yourself not in isolation, but in a courtroom of heaven. Not condemned, but acknowledged, where your hidden tears, your silent endurance, your unseen discipline are entered into record, where the accusations of doubt and distraction lose their authority, because evidence of perseverance outweighs them. And in that courtroom atmosphere, a declaration is issued, not against you, but for you, echoing the promise that the years the locusts have eaten are not erased but restored, that wasted seasons were not wasted at all but preparatory, that nothing endured in faith was overlooked. Restoration here does not mean rewind, but recompense, not repetition, but redemption, where clarity returns stronger than confusion once was. As this declaration settles, let the sealing occur internally, the sealing of theta clarity over your mind, the silencing of anxious beta chatter that once dominated your thoughts. Imagine static dissolving as signal strengthens. Imagine noise retreating as focus sharpens, because what you sustain internally shapes what manifests externally. And in this moment, you are not forcing breakthrough, but consenting to it. Consider this a 40-day accelerated clarity decree, not superstition, but intentional expectation. A defined window where you commit to guarding your frequency, practicing stillness, resisting interference, and observing how direction unfolds with increasing precision. In this decree, blocked breakthroughs are released not through frantic effort, but through alignment maintained, and divine instruction becomes less elusive and more immediate, not always dramatic, but unmistakably steady. And as you hold this posture physically and spiritually, understand that activation is not a one-time surge, but a sustained agreement, an ongoing yes to clarity over chaos, to alignment over anxiety, to trust over tension. And in that agreement, your next steps begin to illuminate, not because the path is suddenly easy, but because your perception is now tuned to recognize it. And now you stand at what can only be described as the release from the waiting room. That invisible space where you have sat between promise and manifestation, between prayer and proof, between exhaustion and emergence. And the final question is no longer whether God has spoken or whether resistance was real. The question is whether you are ready to carry what you asked for, whether you are willing to hold the weight of clarity with the same intensity you once held confusion. Because readiness is not about perfection, but about agreement. Not about having no fear, but about choosing alignment despite it. This is the moment where waiting transforms into walking, where preparation converts into participation. And you must answer not with hesitation, but with intention. Stepping into destiny means recognizing that cycles do not break automatically. They break when someone decides to respond differently than those before them. When someone refuses inherited patterns of fear, avoidance, silence, or self-doubt, and that someone is now you, not because you are superior, but because you are aware, and awareness carries responsibility. Generational ceilings are shattered not by force, but by clarity, sustained by frequency maintained, by consistent alignment that rewrites what was once assumed to be permanent. And in choosing to rise, you are not only elevating yourself, but altering trajectories for those connected to you. So let the declaration be verbal, not whispered, but spoken with conviction. Say it aloud if you can, I am ready. Feel how those words shift your internal posture, how they move from doubt into decision. Because spoken agreement reinforces spiritual activation, and what you declare with intention becomes anchored more deeply in your system. This is not emotional hype, but conscious consent to your next season. And as you speak readiness, let the affirmation settle that what was prepared for you is sealed, written, done, not pending approval, but awaiting embodiment, not uncertain, but established. And with that understanding, you are officially dismissed from the waiting season, no longer sitting in anticipation, but stepping into assignment, carrying clarity instead of confusion, moving forward, not because every detail is visible, but because alignment is sufficient. And from this moment on, you do not wait for destiny to find you. You walk as one already commissioned,